Hello and welcome to today's live Publishing Campus online lecture, Why You Can't Afford to Ignore Research and Publication Ethics. My name is Rachel Guest and I'll be moderating this event. We will begin with a 30 to 40 minute presentation that will be followed by a question and answer session. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation using the Ask a Question button on your screen. As over 900 people have registered for this event, we won't have time today to answer every question, but we will answer a selection of the most representative ones. There's also a technician on standby, and should you have any technical problems, please use the live event tech support button on your screen. Now, I'd like to hand you over to your presenter, Katrina Fennell, Director of Journal Services at Elsevier. Katrina, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for joining today and making this investment in the future of your career, because certainly being aware of the issues in research and publication ethics is crucial for your career, and any successful researcher will tell you that, and I'm sure also your supervisor will tell you that these principles are really fundamental to science. Because these principles are so fundamental, it is not only you alone as the researcher or as the author who's considered responsible for upholding ethics. There is a whole culture built around research which tries to uphold the same principles I'm going to speak about today. So that includes everybody from your employer, from your institute, from your supervisor, from funding agencies who are paying for your research, from the government, who indirectly is probably often responsible for the funding body. It also involves very much the scientific journals to whom you will send your research once it's ready, the editors who decide ultimately what will get published, the reviewers who will review your work, and the publishing houses such as Elsevier who are responsible for these journals. So all of these groups feel a responsibility, and that doesn't even include the dedicated groups such as COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is an independent international group that provides best practices and standards of behavior for authors, reviewers, editors, and publishers. And depending on your profession, you may also have a professional body like a medical council or an engineering society, for example, and almost certainly those societies also feel a responsibility to promote the highest standards of ethics. And one of the reasons why this is so important, why all these groups are invested so heavily in upholding these standards, is a very simple one, which is that traditionally research has been very, very largely based on trust. So it's usually not possible for the editor or even the final reader of the article to know that everything that happened in the lab or everything that happened during the simulation that you created. But there's a large element of trust that researchers behave in a responsible way. And what you will see is, and I'm sure you have seen it in the media, in Retraction Watch, if it turns out that that trust is misplaced, if it turns out that a researcher, for example, has committed plagiarism, or worse than that, has been faking their data, then there can be a very strong reaction. It can be an extremely negative experience for those researchers, because it seems that once your fellow scientists and once the public lose trust in you as a researcher, it's extremely difficult, almost impossible sometimes, to earn back that trust. And that's really important, not only about trust in you as an individual or trust in the research that comes out of your institute, but it's also very important for the general public. At the end of the day, a lot of research will be paid for by the taxpayer, and if they start to have the impression that scientists cannot be trusted, they also start to doubt science itself. And then we get into extremely difficult scenarios where they don't trust their doctor, they don't trust having a vaccine, they don't trust that climate change has really been proven, and so on. So there's really a bigger picture here, and I would urge you to think about really the big picture, but also, of course, these issues can have an effect on the individual researcher and everyone around them. So let's talk about some of the core responsibilities of what is expected from an author or a researcher. Well, what you can say is that having a paper published with your name beside it in a journal, hopefully, I hope for you in a prestigious journal, that comes with a lot of credit. So you get credit for that. It's good for your career. It may help you get promoted. It may help you attract future collaborators. And the other side of that credit, you could look at it as being two sides of the one coin. So on the one side, there's all the positives, there's the credit that you get with it. On the other hand, it comes with responsibility. So if you have your name listed as the author of a paper, that has a meaning. It has a meaning to the reader, it has a meaning to the editor, and the meaning is that you are taking a certain responsibility for that paper. And you are responsible for the fact that the paper is original, that if there are any relevant conflicts of interest, that they're mentioned. You're responsible for for you having made a real contribution as an author. Now, these are not all the responsibilities, but since we have limited time today, these are the three I will talk about because they raise a lot of questions. Probably the most fundamental responsibility for an author is something that perhaps almost goes without saying, which is that the research is real, the research has not been faked in any way. But that is a fairly clear responsibility that normally people understand very intuitively. So let's talk about originality and the opposite of originality, I suppose, which is plagiarism. Because plagiarism, as you can see here, there are pretty clear definitions for plagiarism. And probably you all would say that you perhaps even already understand what plagiarism is, because it's a fairly simple principle, which is basically don't pretend that someone else's work is your work. And some people would call it stealing. Basically, don't steal other people's work. So in principle, it's very simple. The reality is that in day-to-day life, there's more complexity to it. So I'll talk about a bit more of the complexity. So for example, what probably most people would think of as very obvious plagiarism would be that an author just copies and pastes a paragraph out of another author's paper and puts it in their own article and doesn't reference the original article. That's probably the most simple example and also one of the easiest ones to catch. So nowadays, well, I wouldn't say most journals, many journals, but certainly nearly all Elsevier journals are checking every single submission for plagiarism. And that type of plagiarism would be spotted very easily. But sometimes there's more complexity than that. So for example, it isn't only words that can be plagiarized. Also, it could be something like a computer program, it could be a figure, it could be an illustration. It doesn't have to be a journal article, it could be a lecture. It's possible someone has seen a presentation at a conference and it hasn't been formally published, but it has been presented in front of others, and then someone goes and tries to publish that research before the true author actually has a chance to publish it themselves. So plagiarism can include all of these different areas, and avoiding being accused of plagiarism is actually very simple. Again, in principle, it's very simple. And the way I would summarize it would basically just be, if in doubt, cite. If you're not sure whether you really need to mention that some of the concepts came from someone else, or if you're using a sentence but it's only one sentence and it's in the introduction of your article, so it's not in the scientific results. If you're not sure, just give the reference that it came from. And the reason for that is very simple, is that if, for example, your paper is being checked by an editor-in-chief and they notice some text that is the same as text from another author, as soon as they would see that you have cited the original author, that gives them a very strong indication that you're trying to do the right thing. So that would be my first advice. Just be careful with your citations. And again, this sounds really obvious, but it isn't always that easy in real life. And one thing I would be careful of, as you're collecting your references, as you're doing your literature search, as you're drafting your paper, don't take chances. So this could happen over months, it could happen sometimes over years. You're not going to remember that, by the way, I need to add that reference later. So always keep the citations in from the very early stage, and don't take them out, because there's always a risk that you will just forget that the reference has been taken out. So I would always keep them there and be very particular about making sure that they're correct. And citation is for more than one reason. So you don't only cite in order to give credit to somebody else. So that is a big part of it. Another part of citing correctly, it shows the editor that you know your subject area. It shows the editor that you understand what has come before you. So there's a famous saying by Newton, I believe it was, who said, if I have created great ideas, it was because I stood on the shoulders of giants. And he means he stood on the shoulders of the people who came before him. And I think every scientist is always in that position. You're always building on the work that was done before you. So be sure to acknowledge it, because it also shows the editor that you know what you're talking about. And of course, you're acknowledging the findings of others, which we mentioned, but also it means that the literature is accurate. It means that, for example, you're giving credit to the original origins of that idea, the originator of that idea. It may be that since the idea was first proposed 20 years ago, many other people have proven it since then, and they may have, but the correct practice is normally to cite the original and not the others who have replicated it since then. And that's also very good practice. It will create a good impression with the editor about your paper in general, not only from an ethical perspective, but also that you really know your area. So another topic in terms of plagiarism that you need to be a little bit careful about is paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is not as basic as just copying and pasting. It's where you more or less have taken somebody else's work, but you change around the word order, or you change around the structure, so that you're not basically blatantly plagiarizing. However, if you do that, you also still need to cite the original reference. So basically, I would say that you can paraphrase. It's fine to do it. It doesn't mean you should not cite. You still have to cite the original. Another alternative to paraphrasing, which to be honest sometimes is clearer, is just to quote directly, but then make it clear within quotation marks that you're quoting directly from the article. And then, of course, you also need to cite the article. And then we get on to another area, which is the area of so-called self-plagiarism. I personally don't really like the phrase self-plagiarism, because plagiarism normally means copying someone else's ideas. So copying your own ideas is not really plagiarism in my view. So I would more call it text recycling. This is also something to be careful with, especially now that most journals are using more plagiarism detection software. Your own words that have been used previously, that will also trigger the software to alert the editor. So basically what I would say is, there's two different ways this could happen. The first one is something that we would call a duplicate, which means that you're publishing a paper, and let's say 90% of the paper you've already published before, and you're just extending it by a small amount. Now, that's a tricky area, but I would say most editors will be looking for you to have added something substantial to the new paper. Most editors will not really be interested in a paper that only has a small amount of additional data that wasn't in your previous paper. Certainly, if you are going to try that, be sure to be open with the editor about the previous paper. You absolutely should mention in your references and probably in your cover letter the previous paper. If it's a scenario like a proceedings where you've presented at a conference and now you're extending the work further, the editor will probably be more open to that, to publishing a paper in that scenario. So also mention that. But the main thing is always mention where it was published, where some of the work was published previously. And the second area is where the paper is new, the results are new. But for example, in your introduction section, the background to your new paper is very similar to the background to your old paper, which is normal. And there again, if you're using the same phrases, same sentences you've used before, do cite the first paper in which you used them. So it's not a problem necessarily to use the same phrases or sentences, but make sure you cite that they were also used in your previous work. So that's in a nutshell the area of plagiarism and how to avoid any sort of misunderstanding or accusation of text recycling, duplication, or plagiarism. So moving on to another area which can be a very sensitive area and extremely important for also the perception of science, which is the area of conflicts of interest. And sometimes the word conflict can make this seem like rather a negative topic, but actually it's really more about making sure that the editor, the reviewers, and the readers have all the information that they need to make a fair assessment of the paper. So it's really just about being open and being transparent. There's nothing necessarily negative about it. So if, for example, we would look at these scenarios, we have a scenario where the researcher owns some stock in an oil company and they're doing an experiment which looks at the environmental effects of oil drilling. We have another scenario where a researcher is developing new technology, but also on top of that, they receive payment as a consultant for a company that looks at new technology. And then a third scenario, which is we come across in Elsevier fairly often, where a researcher is submitting to a journal and the editor-in-chief of that journal is connected to the researcher's institute or even in the same department as them. The last one is a doctor who uses traditional healing and they write a paper on medical technology, which perhaps for them may not be something they would naturally be in favor of. So these are all types of scenarios that can come up and do come up all the time. And what you will see is that you will have scenarios like the scenario where someone has direct financial connection with a company. So for example, scenario 2 where they're a consultant for a company. You also can have indirect financial connections. So for example, an indirect financial connection could be say a surgeon who is very enthusiastic about a certain drug which he really believes is the best drug for post-surgical prevention complications. And then that surgeon is approached by the pharma company who makes the drug, and they would like him to speak on their behalf at conferences and talk about his positive experiences with the drug. So let's say they could offer him an honorarium or pay his expenses or something to do that. So that would be like an indirect financial conflict. Then we have career and intellectual conflicts where it may not be obvious, it may not be that someone is directly making money, but it's in the interest of their career to perhaps be in favor of a certain party or a certain intellectual belief. You can even have institutional conflicts. So for example, you could say in that scenario where the author is in the same department as the editor, you could say it might be difficult for that editor-in-chief to be completely objective about that paper because it's in his institute's interest for the paper to get published in a good journal, for example. And then finally, we have something like personal belief, which is the scenario, for example, here with the doctor who has a strong personal belief in traditional medicine. And as you can see, in all of these scenarios, it is not to say that any of these people are incapable of separating these conflicts from their job. So, for example, an editor-in-chief, and this scenario is probably a little bit close, but an editor-in-chief, it is not unusual for them to get papers from people they know. It's not unusual for them to get papers from areas that of science that they may not personally have a strong belief in, and therefore that's almost a conflict. So the existence of such potential conflicts is not the same thing as saying that this person is being influenced by them. But it's extremely important that the editor, the reviewer, and eventually the reader can see, has transparency on what these potential conflicts could be. Because what it means is it allows all of those people to just take the possibility of a conflict into account. And that's very important. So I'm going to move on to another area, which is, I must say, of all the areas of ethics, it is the one that probably we get the most questions about. I think it creates a lot of confusion. And equally, I would say, in many cases, it may not be a true ethical question. In many cases, the topic of what does it mean to be an author is sometimes less about true ethics, and it's more about politics within a lab. It's to do with how institutes relate to each other, and who the most senior person is in the group, and all those sort of issues can come up. But there can also be real ethical issues around this. But either way, we can tell it creates a lot of questions, so I'll talk about it to also hope that I can answer some of your questions. So basically, it seems very easy for me to define what an author is. It's actually extremely difficult for me to tell you what an author is. And the reason that it's difficult is because I work with journals across all fields, from medicine to high-energy physics, from social sciences to humanities, and almost in all these fields, the field may have a slightly different definition of what it is to be an author. But as a broad definition, we can say that most people will agree, an author is someone who has made a substantive intellectual contribution to a published study. Now, what a substantive intellectual contribution is, that is the part that varies a bit from area to area. What I would say about this topic is, given that it can create a lot of confusion, it can create some very difficult conversations with your colleagues or with perhaps your co-authors in other institutes, please, I would recommend have this conversation early in the work. Perhaps even before you start writing, but certainly by the time you start writing, make sure you have this conversation. Because I can tell you that editors are not very impressed by authors asking for changes to the authorship list after the paper's been through the editorial process or halfway through the process. Editors expect that you have this sorted out before you submit your paper. And they may not be very open to changes after that, so get it right before you submit your paper. And you may even want to make sure you have in writing somewhere the agreement, even if it's informal like an email, but somewhere in writing everyone agreeing on who's going to be the author and the order of the authors depending on how important it is in your field. In some fields, the order of authors is just done alphabetically, and then it's obviously not controversial. So we'll give an example just to try and flesh out the topic a bit further, where a researcher completes her paper, and as she was doing that, she consulted her advisor, had some guidance from them on the experiment, the data analysis, and also on how to write and revise the paper. As well as that, a professor in India assisted her in the data analysis, and also a lab assistant helped her on the practical side of preparing the design and operating the equipment. And she also had some advice from two of her fellow grad students who read the paper and helped her edit it. They were not involved in the actual experiment in any way. So the question is, of all those people involved, so we have the researcher, we have her advisor, we have the professor who did the analysis, we have the lab assistant, and we have her grad student, her fellow students. Who should be listed as an author, and who should be listed first? Well, basically the answer depends on what definition you use of authorship. But for today, we're going to use the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors definition. And I would say, and that's commonly used in medical journals, I would say this is a pretty strict definition of authorship. And the definition is that every author has to have made a substantial contribution from the beginning, basically, so to the conception, the design, acquiring the data. They also have to have been involved in drafting the article. They have to have been involved in approving the final version of the article. And if there would ever be a question about the paper in the future, all authors are considered accountable. So in medicine, this is a fairly commonly used definition. And according to this definition, what we would say would be, in the previous example, is that the researcher themselves, of course, would be an author. Her advisor would most likely qualify as an author because they were involved at all stages. The person doing the data analysis only would not qualify according to this particular definition. The lab assistant wouldn't qualify according to this definition. And her grad students wouldn't qualify according to this definition. What the other groups, other help that she received would be mentioned in the acknowledgements. Now, that is one specific definition, although it's a widely used one in that area. You then have other fields where this would be completely different. So, for example, in an area like high energy physics, where you have huge experiments that are performed using the Large Hadron Collider, there could easily be 1,000 authors, and the contribution of those 1,000 authors will certainly not fit into this definition. However, they will have made a substantial contribution because the experiment they're contributing to is just so incredibly complex that they could easily have spent years working on their contribution, but still not qualify according to the ICMJE definition. So it does depend on your field, and my advice to you would be, if you're not sure what's considered normal in your own area, consult the Guide for Authors, the instructions for authors of the journal that you'd like to submit to, and they will clarify what their definition of an author is. And it may be different depending on the journals, but most likely within your one area, within your field, it's probably fairly consistent. So we know it varies per field, but we can say, as a general rule, that the corresponding author tends to be either the first author, or in some areas, the corresponding author is just the most senior person. And I believe that tradition came from years ago, before email was common, when the junior people in the institute were likely to move, and the more senior people who had tenure were likely to stay. So I think it was a very practical point. If you have a question about this paper 10 years after it's published, who is most likely to still be there? And that was usually the senior person. Hence, they were the corresponding author. But it's also not unusual these days for the first author to be the corresponding author. What you should be aware of is making sure that everybody who fits in the definition, everybody who made a substantial contribution, is listed. And that could be also someone who's left the lab since then. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be listed. The other thing you should absolutely avoid, because it not only would upset the editor, but you can also hurt your reputation with other researchers. Do not add anyone as an author without telling them, without involving them. You may think it's a big compliment because perhaps there was a visiting professor who was very prestigious and he gave you some advice, and that advice really helped you go in a different direction. So you might think it's a big compliment, but people do not like to be added as an author without being told about it. So make sure that you talk to them and make sure they qualify as an author. Because, for example, one conversation does not qualify someone as an author, even if you felt that really helped you intellectually or brought you in a new direction. Yeah, so very important that all authors are aware that they've been included as an author, and that will help avoid any problems later. Now, I hope if you follow all these principles, and especially if you have these conversations early, you will never never get into the difficult area of having an authorship dispute. But in case you would find yourself in that area, do be aware that it's almost impossible for editors to adjudicate on an authorship dispute. And that's simply because the editor and also the publisher, we do not know who did what in the lab. We usually have no way of knowing. So the only way for us to resolve an authorship dispute normally would be to go to the institute and ask them to resolve it. So it's normally better if you can try to resolve it amongst yourself and in an amicable way, will also be better for your future collaboration. It can delay your paper, as I said before. Editors really do not like authors being changed after the editorial process has started. And if you would want to change authors, remove authors, or add authors after your paper is published, that is also something the editor may consider, but certainly it's not a given that they will allow it. And also you would have to have agreement from all authors. So a few articles that I can mention on this topic that are really fantastic. One of them comes from the Committee on Publication Ethics, and it's about how to handle authorship disputes, and it's especially written for younger researchers. I really recommend that article. It's very practical. It gives you advice on how to avoid these scenarios, but also how to deal with these scenarios if they would come up. So just to recap a little bit on what we spoke about today. First, we talked about perhaps the most fundamental of all, which is the most fundamental responsibility of authors, which is that your data has not been fabricated, that your data has not been falsified in any way. And that's the basis almost of our system. So we have a system that's based largely on trust that your data hasn't been faked. And if that trust would be violated, I'm afraid it could be extremely difficult for your career to recover from it. What you will find, what we're finding more and more, is that it's becoming more normal and encouraged by funding bodies and by institutes for authors to share their actual raw data. And there's a lot of benefits to sharing the data. I mean, one of which is obviously that it makes it very clear that you have nothing to hide, that everything's transparent, but that's one benefit. The other major benefit is if anyone would like to try and reproduce your work, it makes it easy for people to do that. And that only would show that your work, that would only give your work more credibility. If others will reproduce your work, it will give you extra credibility. So I think it's only in the author's favor. We talked about the need for the work and the text to be original and all the different areas of plagiarism and how to avoid them. Of course, we talked about conflicts of interest and the need to just declare to the editor and therefore potentially to the reader of any financial or any other personal conflict that you might be influenced by. And lastly, of course, we talked about authorship and the complexity that we see within authorship. So I hope that that was helpful for you today. If you have more questions, I see some of you are already submitting questions. Please feel free to ask anything that I haven't covered.
Thank you very much, Katrina. We're now going to move on to the question and answer part of this lecture. Thanks to everyone who sent a question during the presentation. You can still continue to do so now. I've selected several which are representative of the type of questions that we've received. Katrina, first of all, is it okay to submit a paper published in an English language journal in a language other than English to another journal in a different country?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and this is a situation that, I guess, before the internet, this question would come up more often, where journals were distributed in print in one language, and it was possible that the whole rest of the world, for example, the Spanish-speaking world, the French-speaking world, did not have access to the paper. I think nowadays, this is, and then in some cases, we would publish a translation in another journal, but always mentioning that it was first published in the first journal in English. Honestly, nowadays, I think journals are probably less interested in doing this. And the reason is that with almost all journals now being available online, and with technology like Google Translate, I think there's probably less demand for that sort of service, but it would really be up to the editor. So I would just approach the editor, be obviously open about the fact the paper is published somewhere else, and they can decide. They would also have to agree with the original journal about copyright, because the original journal may have the copyright. But certainly you can approach the editor and ask them. I can't guarantee nowadays that it would be always allowed.
Okay, thank you. I've got a scenario for you now, Katrina. I'm working on a study for my PhD, and the results are not confirming the hypothesis, so no matter how many times I rerun the test. How do I solve this problem in an ethical way?
Oh, okay, this is a nice question. Okay, so I suppose there's many ways you could try to solve this problem. I mean, the first point is, of course, without knowing the science, it's impossible to know why the hypothesis isn't being confirmed. One reason it's not being confirmed could be that the hypothesis is wrong. And that, for example, in itself, could be useful finding to share with the world. So it could be that on its own, having proven that this hypothesis is wrong, would be worthwhile paper to write and would be happily published by an editor. And it would save someone else doing this work that you've just spent months perhaps doing. So that's one scenario. The other scenario, which is more something you would really have to talk to your supervisor about, is whether or not there could be anything wrong in the methodology or the approach, and whether other methodology or other approaches could be considered. But indeed, you shouldn't, if you cannot confirm the hypothesis at a certain point, there could be the conclusion that the hypothesis is simply wrong, and in itself, there's nothing wrong with such a finding, and I think journals are more and more open to receiving what you would call negative results like that.
Okay, thank you. I have another question on self-plagiarism. How can I convince an author that it's not good to use a piece of text which has already been published without references?
It's already been published without references, so it's their own paper. Yeah. Well, I'm assuming that it's enough text. It's not a couple of words. It's enough text that they should be referencing it. Well, I suppose, I don't mean to be dramatic about it, but I suppose one way of convincing them could be that if it was to be published in that way, there theoretically could be an objection to it, and it could resolve in potential retraction, for example, if it was serious enough. Because what some people would perceive, I'm going to assume, since I don't really myself use the phrase self-plagiarism, I'm going to assume this is duplication, where most of the paper has already been published already, and most of the science has already been published. That is not considered, duplication isn't considered to be ethical behavior, and one of the reasons is because it can be perceived as someone trying to basically pad their CV. So it looks as if you have published 2 papers when actually you only published 1 paper. That would not go down well, for example, if you apply for a job and they do their homework and they go through your publications, they realize that actually you've only published half as many papers as it looks as you have published. So I think it could be very bad for their future promotional prospects. Worst case scenario, the paper could get retracted. Yeah, I don't mean that you should, I suppose, try to scare them, but I think realistically I would be open with them about some of the things the consequences of that.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that's come through about technicians who help doing experiments. Should they be authors or acknowledged individuals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I hate to give the answer that it depends, but it does depend a bit. So, for example, if you would be submitting to a journal that is a member of the ICMJE, International Council of Medical Journal Editors and uses their principles for authorship, then definitely a technician would not qualify as an author. They would be an acknowledged individual. However, there are other scenarios where, for example, we have some journals nowadays that focus particularly on methods and finding innovative methods. Elsevier has one, for example, called Methods X, and there's more of them. Also the Journal of Video Experiments. And then where the focus of the actual article is on the methodology, and if that technician was involved in, heavily involved in developing that new method, then I think in that scenario they would qualify as an author. So I would, if in doubt, you can always just ask the editor of the journal which policies they follow. But those are two of the scenarios I can imagine, which I know give two different answers, but it just goes to show how it does depend on the field.
Okay, thank you. And a final question, Katrina. If I use a guide as a postgraduate course and it gave me an idea for research, should I be citing that original guide? The idea.
I'm not sure what the guide refers to be honest. Can you repeat the question for me again? Maybe I need to think about it first.
If I use a guide for a postgraduate course, so I'm presuming a course directory or some guide that's used within the course itself, and it gives me an idea about research to conduct, should I be citing that guide in my research?
Yeah, I think, why not? I would always say the worst, you can never really be accused of oversighting. So if it inspired the idea, I see no harm in citing it, and if the editor finds it inappropriate, they could always take it out, but it seems unlikely. I think you would always say safer to err on the side of caution. And if something inspired the idea, yeah, absolutely cite it.
Okay, thank you very much, Katrina. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thanks to our presenter and thanks to everyone who's taken part in this webinar and sent in their questions. If you would like to revisit this material or share it with your colleagues, an archived version of the lecture will be available in a few days on the Publishing Campus website. I hope you found this lecture useful and you'll join us for future Publishing Campus events. Goodbye.